Well, hello there. My name is Matt Edmondson and welcome to What's the Story, a podcast where we hear stories about faith and courage from everyday people. And today we are going to get started with Esther Richards. We're going to be talking about what it's like to be a student. We're going to be talking about mental health and the struggles that Esther had, to mention just a few of the amazing things. Now, this episode is brought to you by Crowd Church, which is an online church. You know, there may be times when not everyone can get to a church building, and it might not even be a place where you actually want to go to. And this is where online church works really, really well. It's super accessible and a safe space to explore the Christian faith. And the thing that I love about Crowd is that it is online first, meaning that it doesn't talk just at you, but rather it's a conversation with you, which you can join in through the comments, you can ask your questions, you can share your stories. And so regardless of where you are at on your faith journey, it is definitely worth checking out. Just head over to www.crowd.church, or you can email me directly at matt@crowdchurch with any questions. Now, before we get into today's conversation with Esther, I just wanted to mention that it is definitely worth checking out Esther's talk, which she did for Crowd Church, called What Does the Bible Say About Trusting God? Now, Esther is part of the student ministry at Frontline Church. She lives in Liverpool with her newly crowned husband, Chris. Esther is has an archaeology degree and loves to learn about ancient civilizations. She enjoys spending time with friends and with family. And so without further ado, here's my conversation with Esther. My name is Matt Edmondson, and this is a podcast where we talk to our guests about their Christian faith, difficulties they have overcome in life, and what their hopes are for the future. So my aim, simply with this podcast, is hopefully to inspire you and encourage you in the Christian faith, regardless of where you are at on your journey. We just talk to real people and dig into their real story. Now, Crowd Stories is part of Crowd Church, and if you would like to know more about the church or about the Christian faith, you can check it all out on our website at www.crowd.church. And of course, you can subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast from to make sure you never miss out on an episode. Now, today, I have the fab pleasure of talking to the newly crowned Esther Richards. We were just talking then before we hit the record button. Is it Esther Norris or Esther Richards? And you were Esther Norris and you are now Esther Richards and have been for a whole month. Is that right?
A whole month. That is correct, yes. A whole month.
A whole month. Do you feel like just like you've been married forever now?
Yeah, although I actually did say to him yesterday, I was like, do you ever forget that we're married? Because I'm like, oh yeah, we did that. That happened. So I just lose track. And I'm like, oh yeah, we got married.
Oh yeah, we did that thing. We did that thing a month ago. Were you guys engaged for a while?
Just over a year. So we kind of, in an ideal world, would have been shorter, but we pushed it because of COVID. So we were planning to have as COVID-free wedding as possible, which we almost managed. But in theory, it was a regular wedding, so it was all right.
Okay. And recently, Esther, we've had you on at Crowd. You've done your first Crowd talk. You've got that under your belt. Now you're on Crowd Stories. So you're a regular here now, aren't you? You're sort of a regular face on the old Crowd telly system that we've got going on. So thank you for doing this. Thank you for doing Crowd Stories. It's great to talk to you. I've been looking forward to this conversation for since we've agreed to do it, actually, and keen to dig into the story. But before we get into it a little bit, I'm curious to know what the first month of marriage. I've been married 24 years, so I there's no way I can remember back to the first month I was married. I just can't. So you know, what advice now that you've been married a month? What advice would you have given yourself if you could go back and have a conversation with yourself? I don't know, pick a time frame, 3-6 months ago when you were engaged, or you were just thinking about to get married. What sort of things have you learned that you wish you knew back then?
Good question. I think in terms of the wedding day itself, it was like, as long as you get married and you have a nice time, that is literally all that matters. To just chill out, take it easy. In terms of, I feel like, I don't know, that's 1 month. I think I actually got a great piece of advice from John Harding recently. And he said,
Okay.
actually, as newlyweds, you're still in a time of transition. That it's not actually that you're just married and now you just know how to do marriage. That you're still, that good chunk of time as newlyweds, you're still learning. You're still in this big time of change. So it's all right that you haven't worked out rhythms and how it works naturally yet. And I think that's been like really key this month. It's been like, it's all right. We're still working it out. Things are still changing, even though we already had the wedding. This is the real bit now. So yeah. Still a time.
Now you've got to figure it all out.
Exactly. Yeah. Now I've got the rest.
It is.
Life.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way to think about it, actually. Time of transition. I don't know if 24 years later I'm out of that time of transition. If I'm honest with you, I think I'm still learning. I think I'm still figuring it out, and that's just kind of the way it is. So, well, congratulations on your wedding, and you're making it through the first month. It's just. Marriage, as you have found out, is one of the most life-changing things, and it's just extraordinary. So I'm stoked for you, and hope it goes super, super well. I've been, like I say, married 24 years. Best decision I ever made. She's awesome, my wife, and it changes your life for the better. So awesome, and congratulations.
Awesome. Thank you.
So. I don't know. It's just, it is what it is, isn't it? It's now the rest of your life as Mrs. Richards, and that's awesome. So, but of course, you weren't always Mrs. Richards. You were Esther Norris, and I know you because of Frontline Church. We both go to the church, and that's where we met. And I've known you. I tried to think about how long I've known you for. It's going to be a couple of years. How long have you been in Frontline now?
It will be 5 years in September since I moved.
And did you come as a student?
Yeah, I did. So I moved to Liverpool as a student in 2017 and came to Frontline in my second week in Liverpool. And we said, we'll try a few different churches just in case. And then got back to the next week and we were like, let's just go back. And I've been there ever since. Just stuck around. It's been great.
It's never could leave after that.
No,
what was it that drew you in?
I think everyone was just really excited to be there. And there was just this like real sense of community and relationship. But also you could tell that people that were there were excited about Jesus. And I was like, this is the kind of church I want to be part of. So I think that's what made all the difference. Yeah.
That's a really interesting point, isn't it? It's these things that you just sort of pick up that draw you in, and you kind of like. It's an interesting thing how that works. So you came to university then as a Christian. So at what point? I guess were you born a Christian? Have you always been a Christian? Was there a specific point for you? Just tell us a little bit about your journey. So
I grew up in a Christian family. Of generations of Christians. So both sets of my grandparents were Christians, and some of their parents were as well. So really like going through the generations. So it's something that I just kind of always lived. I think I said the kind of classic prayer that kids say when they want to be a Christian when I was probably about 5 or 6. So pretty young, but I think it became like a decision that I actively made for myself when I was about 12. And I experienced the presence of the Holy Spirit for the first time. And that was when I was like, okay, I'm in this. This is what I want to dedicate my life to. So kind of would have always said I was a Christian, but that kind of around 12 was when I was like, oh no, this is it. This is what I want to do forever. But yeah, I grew up in a Christian family. All my family Christian.
So what do you mean when you say you had this sort of encounter with the presence of the Holy Spirit for the first time? I mean, I'm asking you, I mean, I know what that means for me. But if you've never been into church, if you've never experienced that, what does that actually mean?
So for me, at least that time, I was at a camp, for like a youth camp called New Day, and we basically were in like in song worship, and I was praying, and I just felt this like overwhelming but unexplainable sense of peace and joy and just excitement about life. And it was never something that I could have conjured up for myself. And it just got into every part of me and was unexplainable. I couldn't be like, oh, that's just because I'm having a nice time with my friends. It was just very clear that this was not from me. This was from God. And I it was a bit easier because it had been explained to me before that happened. So I could recognize it because I'd grown up around it. So I kind of knew that it might happen one day, but it was like unlike anything I'd ever expected. And since then, in those moments like of just complete, feeling the presence of Holy Spirit, it is like this unexplainable feeling of joy and peace that it could not have come from inside of me. I think that's how I'd explain it.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good, because I think it's one of those things, isn't it? And we're Christians, a lot of Christians will have experiences of God, which I think is great. I think it's in the Bible. You know, Paul prays that we would know the love of God, which means know through experience, right? When you look at the original language, it's like know and experience. I'm praying that you actually experience the love of God, the full width, breadth, depth, and height of it. I mean, that's a lot of love to experience, right? And so when that experience manifests, what that looks like and feels like, I think it's interesting when you talk to people about it, and they often use this phrase. I just felt, I don't know how to describe it other than I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. It's a common sort of phrase, an overwhelming sense of joy, and that tends to be a lot of people's experience, certainly early experiences with the Holy Spirit, is this sort of just sense of peace, of love, of joy. And they can't explain it, they can't describe it, but they're the best words that they can use to sort of go with it.
Yeah, and I think it's because I would have a distinction between joy and happiness, because I wasn't just like feeling excited and feeling happy, but it's like to the depths of who you are, like something switches and you feel joy rather than just happiness that might fade, but it feels really significant, and you think, wow, like that's changed me because I now have joy rather than just feeling happy sometimes. And I think that was another part of the difference, like that felt different to just human happiness.
Yeah, that's good. And I like that, because here you are, sort of, you've always considered yourself a Christian, but there's still an element of finding that out for yourself, especially if you've grown up in a Christian family, still an element of discovering your own faith, and still an element of actually experiencing God, and it not just being a lofty, do you know what I mean, a mental idea. I mean, it's good, don't get me wrong, the mental knowledge in a sense, but it's more than that. So at 12 years old, you have this experience with the Holy Spirit. At this point, you kind of go, yeah, this is game on, right? And this is language I would use, Esther, sorry to... but it's kind of like, game on, here we go. So does life take a radical turn at 12 years old? What happens next?
It probably didn't take that much, to be honest. I think that I grew up, so my dad led the church that I was part of. My parents started that church when I was about 5 or 6. So I was already just very involved in church. It's kind of what happens when your parents lead the church. You kind of fill all the volunteering gaps. And so I was already like super involved. But I think the difference would have been my desire to do that, rather than just being like, oh, I need to do this. Was that, oh, I'm excited to serve. And so I think that was a significant difference. And I think I started taking on a little bit more kind of leadership stuff obviously on like a small scale as a 12-year-old, but with friends, but also then eventually in a few years' time, I helped lead our youth group when I was about 16. So I think it was more of a mindset change than a life change, because I was already so invested in and in the church. But yeah, I think my mindset, I was like, oh no, this is out, I'm serving out of a desire to, rather than thinking, well, my mom and dad told me to, so I probably should. So I think that's probably the biggest switch. Yeah.
Okay. And so you 12 years old to, when did you go to Liverpool? When you're 18, 19 years old, somewhere in there?
18.
So what happened in that time frame? How did you get from where you were to Liverpool?
Lots happened. So I actually spent from about the age of 10 or 11, actually until the age of probably about 2021, really quite ill with my mental health.
Okay.
So I started off with like a lot of anxiety around school stuff. My mum would always say like, oh, she was a bit of a worrier as a kid. But then when I was probably about 11, I had some issues with friends at school. And so I had like physical illness symptoms, but had nothing was physically wrong with me. And the doctor was like, oh, maybe it's an anxiety thing. But I was like, oh, I'm fine. And then that just basically got progressively worse throughout my teenage years. And so developed into major, just like general anxiety, but also a lot of social anxiety, really suffered with panic attacks, and then eventually depression. The depression started probably when I was about 16, 17 was when that got really bad. Kind of just powered through it, to be honest. Lots of doctor's appointments that didn't really go anywhere. Some like school counselling that I had, which was helpful. But then eventually, once I turned 18, they gave me antidepressants, and that helped. But basically just got through high school, essentially. I think a lot of my friends were struggling with some similar things, so there was some kind of camaraderie in that, I think. And then just found Liverpool, decided to go to Liverpool for uni. I studied archaeology with Egyptology, and I was like, that sounds cool, I'll do that. Didn't really have much of a sense of like, oh, I really want to do this, because I didn't really see my future, because I just saw that I was struggling. And so I thought, well, there can't be much of a future for me. So I'll just pick something that sounds interesting, because it doesn't really matter what comes next. But when I came to visit Liverpool with my dad for an open day, had a real gut feeling like this is where I'm supposed to be. And I know that was God speaking, because that's often how God speaks to me, is through my gut feelings. But yeah, it wasn't, I didn't like hear anything. I remember I was sat in the Costa on the Albert Docks waiting for my dad to bring over the drinks. And I was sat there and I just thought, this is where I'm going to be. And didn't do very well in my A-levels at all, but still got a place. So I figured that's probably also a good sign that that's where God wanted me. So
they let you in.
They let me in, yeah. Or it's just such a niche course that they let everyone in who applied, so they had the numbers. Is also a possibility. But yeah, that's kind of how I ended up in Liverpool, but just by kind of scraping through, to be honest, of all of my exams and things, and just getting by as much as possible.
Okay, well, okay, there's a lot there. If you don't mind, we're going to dig in. We can't just brush over some of these things.
No, let's do it.
So you struggled then a lot with mental health during your teenage years.
Yeah.
And you were struggling with mental health through your A-levels, and were you struggling with mental health when you were in Liverpool in the early days as well?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So, do you know what kick-started the anxiety? You said something that happened about 11, but your mum's always called you a bit of a worrier. Is that so? Had you always been anxious as a kid, do you think, or was there a trigger point?
So. I think that I would. So there's like different types of mental health, and sometimes mental illness is like caused by situations, and sometimes it's just to do with the chemicals in your brain and the way that your brain is wired. And so there's some history of it in my family, and again, for a few generations. So I think in terms of generally, I don't think there's anything that really kick-started it. I had some, like when I was about 17, we had some like family stuff go down that didn't help, but I was already pretty bad at that point, so that didn't really make that much difference. So yeah, I would say it was just kind of always there. And the doctors would often say to me, like, you will deal with this for your whole life. That's what they told me. They said, you'll be able to get a little bit better and you'll have help, but you'll probably never come off antidepressants and you'll probably always be in therapy, because they were like, this is just how you are. So yeah, nothing.
To deliver hope there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's kind of what I was living like under, having that spoken over me basically as a teenager, and into when I moved to Liverpool in my first year of uni.
So do you remember then being anxious as a kid before you were a teenager, or is this something that you sort of, it's a wrong phrase, but is this something you sort of grew into as a teenager?
I think I was anxious as a kid. I mean, I don't massively remember, but I think I was like a bit of a worrier, and I did, I wasn't always the most like adventurous and confident. I was quite shy, like quite quiet, I think. I mean, maybe my mum might listen to this and go, she was a nightmare. She definitely wasn't quiet. I'm not sure. I remember. You never know. I will find out.
She was an angel. She was an angel.
Exactly. That's great. But yeah, I always like struggled making friends and things like that. So I think I always was. And then I think, being a teenager is like hard. I was saying this today, actually, weirdly. I do not miss being a teenager at all. It's really hard, and I think it gets harder as time goes on. And so I think if there's already a bit of that in you anyway, in how you naturally respond to situations, then being a teenager often just makes it worse, because there's a lot to think about and learn and work out. So I think it was there, but was exacerbated by teenage life.
And so you've got this sort of general anxiety, as you call it, just the general worries about life, but you use this phrase social anxiety. What did that look like for you?
So I think immediately of my prom, we had, I had a weird school system. So I went to middle school and high school, even though it was in England. So I got 2 proms. But so in year 8, I had a prom, obviously. And I was getting ready for it, and my friends were about to arrive, and I was running around the house like a mad person trying to get everything together. And I remember standing in my parents' living room, just like breathing really, really, really fast. And my mum was like, okay, you okay? Like, chill out. But I couldn't put like an obvious rational reason as to why I was feeling anxious. But I knew that people were I was going to be around people. And I'm naturally introverted anyway, but that is different to social anxiety. They're 2 different things. But it was like this thought of being around people just made me anxious, and I couldn't explain it. And when it was really bad, it would stop me going out and doing things. So especially when I was in university, there'd be days where I would just stay in my room and sometimes like wouldn't eat, or would like run out to like heat something up in the microwave and run back to my room, because the fear of seeing other people was so much that it would stop me from leaving the house. But it was never something I could explain. So I couldn't be like, oh, I'm nervous that this would happen, because I knew it wasn't rational, which is how you know it's something that's like an illness, because it's not rational and it's not, you can't like think it away. It was just there, and there wasn't, I couldn't challenge it.
So, I mean, that all sounds pretty horrendous, if I'm honest with you, Esther. So, how bad did it actually get for you? The whole mental health thing. How low did you actually go?
It got pretty bad. So it got worse when I went to university. I think again, first year of university can be really hard. New place, new people, new everything. I had already had some like incidences of self-harm when I was a teenager, but that got worse when I got to university. And I, again, had this when I was a teenager, but got worse in university, where I just was like, there's literally no point me being alive. That was kind of where my headspace was, because I was like, well, I don't have that much impact. People probably wouldn't even notice if I stopped living. That was genuinely what my head would tell me. So I was, when I would say it was probably like around the February of my first year of university. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I called my sister. I called my mum, she didn't pick up because it was 3 o'clock in the morning. And I called my sister, and she did pick up. And I was like, I just don't feel safe by myself, because I didn't want to live anymore. But I also, there was this instinct inside of me that also was like, yeah, but you should probably live. So I think there's this, it's really hard to explain. There's this like weird kind of conflicting thing that happens where you're like, I don't want to be alive, but also I don't want to die. And it's really hard to explain unless you've been there. But I ended up walking at 3 a.m. to Liverpool Royal A&E. And my dad, bless him, managed to wake up my parents. And my dad got in the car and drove from just south of Birmingham all the way up to Liverpool, 3 o'clock in the morning, to come and get me. But sat in A&E for about 6 hours, because they only had one mental health person on staff that night, so they couldn't get around to seeing me. But I remember walking up the road and just like walking up the path towards the Royal, and just looking at the path and like not letting myself look at the road, because I was scared that I would walk straight into it. Because I was like at that point where I was like, I'm done. I just don't want to. So I was like, just look at the path, just look at the path, because I didn't want to be tempted by the road, which is like, it's heavy, but you know, it happened. It's real. It happens to people. That was my lowest point. And my absolute legend of a dad came and picked me up. He sat with me in A&E for a bit, and then I'd been there probably for about 3 or 4 hours. And they came to me and said, listen, it'll be another 6 hours. And I was just like, I'm tired. I'm done. I'm exhausted. And I was really afraid of being admitted into hospital. I knew that, actually, that looking back now, maybe I needed that. I don't know. But also, I would have actually been able to say no to that if I had wanted to, but I was really afraid. So I just said, Dad, just take me home. So went home, and I stayed at home for about a week, and then went back to university. But that was really the lowest that it got. That was the closest it got to anything like really terrible happening.
Wow. So, I mean, you've answered this question, and thank you for sharing, Esther, and it's not easy stuff to talk about, I appreciate. And as you were talking, the question that I wrote down in I have a little notebook here where I jot down all my questions as we go along. How did your parents deal with all of this? Because obviously you've moved away from home. The mental health issues have got worse. And your dad's obviously struggling with this because he's getting in a car at 3 o'clock in the morning. I mean, your dad is a legend. I mean, you know, and I feel your dad's heart, because I have a daughter, and you just kind of go, of course I'm going to get in the car at 3 o'clock in the morning. Why would I not? But how have they dealt with it, and how have they kind of supported you throughout this time? I guess is another question.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when I was a teenager and I was first struggling with it, I remember them saying to me, like, this is still new to us, so you're going to have to be patient with us because we don't know how to deal with this. So they were super honest with me from the start, which is always helpful. And it took me a while to talk to them because there's like stigma and everything that comes with it all. But they were great. I mean, they would chat to me when I needed chatting to, and I was like, just need to have a conversation or cry or rant or whatever. I don't really know how. I imagine it was really hard because I'm their kid. So obviously that is not what they want me to experience. They would never, I don't think they ever really like went into detail about how it affected them. I remember just before I moved to Liverpool, I remember my mum saying to me, like, you don't have to go. Like, it's okay, you can stay if you don't think you can cope. And I think part of me, I can be quite stubborn. So that I was like, well, I'll definitely go it now. But that was the 18-year-old in me. So, and I think I kind of saw that they really wanted to protect me, but they were amazing because they didn't hold me back, and they trusted that I knew myself enough to know whether I could do it or not, which was amazing. And I know that a lot of people don't have that, and they really we'll just follow your lead, basically. So, and I remember, I mean, this is a bit of a, I guess, spoiler for later, but I remember when I told my dad that I'd stopped taking my antidepressants, I'd come off them. Like, I remember his reaction was just awesome. Like, he was so excited, and he gave me this massive hug. And I think then I was like, oh, this has really affected them, like, a lot, when I saw it afterwards. But yeah, I don't really know. I think both my parents have had experiences with mental health here and there. I think as everyone has, like, everyone goes through stuff. But yeah, I think it must have been tricky, but they did a great job. I think they probably don't realize quite how good of a job they did. But yeah, I think they just trusted me to know my limit, but because they'd already set up that I could come and talk to them if I needed them. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they both
that's wonderful. And imagine, I imagine there were a lot of prayers behind closed doors. Is what I imagine was going on a lot there. Yeah. So here you are at your lowest point, right? You've wandered into hospital. Your eyes are focused on the pavement, and obviously you've given us a slight spoiler alert. But before we get into what happened and maybe how God worked with you to come through this, how did you reconcile in your head? Or did you reconcile in your head this idea of mental health, the stigma, and how did God let me get here?
Sure.
You know what I mean? This is because none of this should add up, right? None of this should equate, and I know a lot of people struggle with this type of thing. So how are you at this point dealing with that? The health issues and the theology.
Yeah. I mean, that was really hard because obviously, like, growing up with it. With knowing the Bible and knowing that, truly believing that God had the best for me and that God made all the right decisions, to then be sat in a position like that, I was like, hang on a minute, this doesn't make any sense. I remember reading, there's a verse in the Bible that says, for God did not give me a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of a sound mind. And I remember reading that really specific translation of sound mind. And I was like, well, I do not, my mind is anything but sound. I remember going to my dad and being like, this does not describe me. I was like, I am fearful. That is what I felt like. And I remember my dad giving me this explanation of it's a promise. And we do live in this, like, what we like to call this tension of the now and the not yet, which we like to use to explain things, which doesn't necessarily always help explain things, but it is true. But that actually that's God's promise over us, and that we still live in this world. And so we live in the world that is fallen, even though we are God's people who he has saved and made holy. We live in the world and we live in these bodies. And so, I mean, it was really, really hard. And I think that one of the things I remember saying to somebody, it was probably my dad, was like, the best thing about all of this is that I have learned that I definitely actually trust God. Because I think when everything's great, when you go, like, especially if you're young and you grow up in a Christian family, you think, yeah, I think I trust God, but it's never been tested before. Like, I just assume that I do. But then I went through something like that bad, and I was like, well, no, I really trust God. I trust that he's doing the right thing. And I can't really attest that to anything. Like, I'm not like, oh, great, I did a good job because I trusted. And I do think that was just off the back of, like, knowing him well and spending time with him, but also the prayer of people around me. because prayer is just so powerful. But I remember multiple times sitting in my bedroom at home and in halls, just crying, like absolutely devastating, having a horrible time, and just saying, God, I trust you. And just like saying that over and over again, because it was literally all that I had. So I think that in some ways, being completely without anything else, I was like, well, I only have God. So I don't believe that he's given me this. I don't believe that he's made me like this. So I have to trust that he'll bring me out of it. And there was just a huge amount of prayer in it as well, from myself, from other people, probably more than I even know about. And I think that was the only way, because I couldn't explain it away. Like I couldn't, and I'm sure that there are people that know theology of it really, really well. But for me, it was like this: I just know that God has me and that he will use it for good, because I trust that, because it's all I could do. And if I didn't have that, I probably wouldn't be here today, because that was the only thing I had to lean on. I like to joke, when I talk to people about the power of prayer, I say, you've got to be careful, because God does answer prayers. And when I was a teenager, I loved the song Oceans. And there's that line in it that says, Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. And I really prayed that as a teenager. I was like, yes, come on. I want to be somewhere where the only thing I can do is trust in you. And I had these visions of being like in amazing places, doing crazy things, and like only trusting in God. And it wasn't what I thought it would look like, but it was an answer to prayer, because I had to trust him, because he was all that I had. And so I think, as hard as it is sometimes to kind of wrestle with that, but why, we know that God is good regardless. And so we have to lean on that, because that is the only thing that is going to get us through those points in life.
So when you say you had to trust God, and interestingly enough, the talk you did for Crowd is, what does the Bible say about trusting in God? And so if you want to know more, go and check that out. It'll be on the Crowd website. But a great talk by Esther where she talks about this in much more detail. But just a quick summary: what do you mean when you say I had to trust God? And you're sat in your bed, you're in tears, there's nothing else, and you're just going, God, I trust you. What did you mean when you were saying that statement?
I think that it's like giving up the right to understand what's happening in some ways. And it's deciding, well, I think part of it is realizing that nothing else fits and nothing else works. So as amazing as my parents and my friends and my family were, they actually couldn't fix me. And I'd been to numerous doctors and therapists, and nothing had like fixed it. So I think that was part of it, is like, none of these things work. So I can't trust those entirely and completely to solve this problem. But I think that for me, it was thinking, well, I still don't understand this, but I'm just going to choose to believe that God knows what he's doing and that he knows better than me. And I think that is one of the, it's a really hard thing to do. And I think we have to do it constantly. It's not like I did it once and now I'm sorted. I have to do it on the daily. But it's, I think it's this thing of going, well, I really wish I could understand what's happening, but I don't. And I'm going to say that that's okay, because I believe that God does know what's happening and he's more powerful and better than me anyway. So it's probably a better thing that he knows what's going on than I do. And choosing not to lean on my own understanding of the world. I think that's
a really powerful statement. The trusting in God is giving up the right to try and understand what's happening, and just go, God, you've obviously got a plan here. And that, I think it can sound, if I'm honest with you, Esther, if I wasn't a Christian, right, and I know what you mean, having been in those places, but if I wasn't a Christian, it can sound a bit like I've given up the fight. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm just kind of just going like this, and it's like, que sera, sera, whatever will be, kind of thing. if God wills it, and all that sort of stuff. And it can sound a bit like that, but I don't think that's what you're saying, is it?
No, I think, yeah, I know what you mean. It does sound like, oh well, whatever happens happens. I think that the part of it is there's a hope in it, because it wasn't just me sitting back and going, all right, what happens happens. That was me on the day before my wedding. I was like, do you know, at this point, what happens happens. It's fine. But at that point, it wasn't that. It was. I guess there's an element of, well, what's going to happen is going to happen because God's on it. But there's a hope in it of what happens will happen, but it will be better than what is right now. And it will get better because what God has in mind for me is the best thing. And God's plan and purpose for me is the best plan and purpose for me that could exist. So it's not a pessimistic, all right, whatever happens, but it's actually God has this and I'm going to let him do that. Yeah, I think that's probably how I would kind of come back from. Yeah, it's not, and also I think that that actually that's true freedom, because the world likes to tell us that freedom is getting to choose whatever we want to do, but actually Jesus means that our freedom is saying, I don't have to make these decisions. Like it's not on me to get it right. It's not on me to get better. I don't have to make sure I go to the right doctor and make sure that I do this, that, and the other. Yeah, I'm going to try. And I still went to all of my appointments and I still did all those things because it's still important and valuable. But I was trusting in God for the outcome. And that was where the freedom came from, because it's not on me anymore. I don't have to get it right because God's doing it for me.
Yeah. Wow. That is what we call in the trade a mic drop moment right there. That's fantastic. So here you are at uni, life's bad, your dad sat there with you at A&E, you go back home for a week, that's your lowest point. You're on, and I've heard what you've said now about trusting God and just your attitude and your belief and your desire in that. Is that the point? Is it? Well, let me rephrase the question. When did it turn around, and how did it start to turn around for you?
So when I was in A&E, when the I can't remember who it was either like a mental health practitioner or somebody like that, came and said, look, it's going to be 6 hours. You might just want to go home. They recommended that I get an appointment with the Young People's Advisory Service in town, in Liverpool. And that was that. Then I went home. And I put it off for a while because I was just like, I don't even really know. I've never heard of that before, whatever. But then I was like, as my mum actually just kept saying, have you done it yet? Have you called them yet? Have you emailed them yet? Have you tried it out yet? In the way that only a mother can do, in the best way. And so I did it because she was right, obviously, because she's my mum. She's always right. And
I just need to stop you right there. Mum, if you're listening, if you just send me your email, I will send you that clip. You can have that for life and just play it on the TV whenever Esther comes through the house. That's brilliant. Sorry, I interrupted you. I was talking to you, Mum there. Esther, you carry on.
So I went to the Young Person's Advisory Service, and I joined a support group, which I found immensely stressful because I was very socially anxious and I had to go and talk to strangers about what I was feeling, which I hated.
Okay.
But I went, and I managed to get some one-to-one therapy through them as well. And interestingly, I always found people would always say the wait list is really long, like you're going to be on the wait list for like a year. And then I'd pray and ask God to shorten the wait list, and it would be, my waiting time would be at least half what they said every single time. So that was always very good. So I had some one-to-one therapy, was on different medication. And one of the like biggest moments for me that I can look back on and say, that was a real turning point was when I went on a mission trip with the students in Frontline to Romania in the summer of 2018. And within that group of people, it was actually a lot of people I didn't know. My housemate had come with me. He wasn't a Christian, but she had a great time. It was great. But
your housemate who wasn't a Christian went on a mission?
Yeah, she went twice, actually. It was awesome.
Okay.
She's great.
Okay,
so, yeah, and within that group of people, I didn't know very many of them very well. But I'd felt really like, yeah, I need to do this. Like, this is a thing I've always wanted to do. I'm not going to let my brain stop me, because it had stopped me on going on other cool, exciting trips. So I was like, I'm doing this one. So I went, and this group of people didn't know me as someone who was anxious and depressed. But so many of my other friends knew that I had all this going on. And this group of people didn't know that. That's not how they saw me. They saw me as someone who loved Jesus, who was leading, who was a friend, who was fun, who was enjoyable to be around. And I think like God showed me a large part of my actual identity during that trip, of not this person who just is an anxious person, but who is actually fun and is like nice to be around and nice to spend time with, and also is someone that is loved by God and other people. And that was a really big thing. Like, I knew I was loved by God because I was like, well, it's a fact. And I knew that my parents loved me because I was like, you know, that's part of their job. But I was like, other people don't really need to, they probably don't. But on that trip, I experienced other people's love for God and for me. And I was like, oh, this is what this could look like. So I think that was a massive turning point, and really just like increased my confidence, because also we just had an awesome time. And kind of from that moment, things just changed. Things just started to change. I carried on in therapy. I came off my medication in December of 2018, and I had my last session of therapy in January 2019. But I think all through that summer, and then that term of my second year of university, I just had the most amazing community of people around me who loved me for who God had made me to be, and who didn't just know me as the anxious person who probably won't turn up because she's too afraid. And it was like God was using these people around me to remind me who I was. And to kind of those things that had been spoken over me when doctors had said, you're never going to get better, this is something you'll live with. I'd taken that and said, well, this is who I am. But actually it wasn't who I was. And God was saying, no, this is who I say you are. And look, these people already know it, so you need to catch up, basically. And that's when it started to turn around. So I think, you know, God uses all sorts of things, and everyone's story will look different. And I had often prayed for an instant healing. I was like, I'm done with this. It's been like a decade. I've had enough. Tired. Just sort it out. Because I believe that God could do it. I was like, I know you do things like this, so can you just do it? But now, looking back, I'm really grateful that it wasn't an instant fix, because I have learned so much about God's faithfulness and God's goodness, and about myself and who God's made me to be through that process, that even though it was really rough, it's been really formative to who I am. But that in itself still doesn't actually define me, because God defines me regardless of my experience of life. But yeah, I think that's when it started to turn around, was like that second half of 2018. And yeah, God I would still say it was a miracle, because everyone said that it would never happen. But it was like a slow burn miracle.
Slow burn miracle.
Yeah. But God used the community and the resources that he'd already placed around me. So he'd known who was going to be my counsellors, he'd known who was going to be my doctors, and he'd given them the right things to say and prescribe. And he'd placed that all there for me. before I even knew that I needed it to help me get through that part of my life.
Wow. So your last therapy session was January 2019,
Yes.
Which at the time of recording is 3 years ago.
Yeah.
How's the last 3 years been? Do you feel like you've got stronger and stronger, or has it been a bit more up and down? Have there still been struggles and fights, or how have you found that?
Kind of both, to be honest. I think that I have got stronger and stronger, but it's also been up and down. I mean, it's been a weird 3 years because there's been a pandemic, and I think that kind of bashed everyone's brains a little bit. So there was that, but my general, like, I would never say at any point that any of my major symptoms have ever returned. I would never say, like, I've really struggled with my mental health. There have been other things I've had to work through. So when you go through something for that long, it does leave marks and patterns of behavior. So I spent so much of my teenage years just trying to get through and survive. There were lots of things I just never learned how to do or didn't remember. I've got like really bad memory of my teenage years because my brain was just like not switched on for it at all. So I kind of had to like retrain myself to socialize, which I'm now having to do again after, lockdown, but aren't we all? And I think that, there's still a lot to learn from it. And I think I am still learning, and life is not always easy. And sometimes I have moments where I'm like, oh gosh, this has been hard, or I notice things. But I think part of that is because of just the way I respond to things. So like when I was talking about being a kid, that I just responded to things in a certain way. Like I think that to some extent I still do that, but it never, ever, ever goes past a healthy level of worry and anxiety. So I don't remember the last time I had a panic attack or got so anxious that I couldn't move or couldn't leave the house. And, I have days where I don't feel great, but like not any more than a regular person does. And I think for me, like getting better from mental illness doesn't look like every single day is perfect, because actually that just doesn't exist. It's just not how life works.
Well, that's just not life, is it?
Exactly. Yeah. But actually what it looks like is being able to deal with that in a healthy way and not letting it. Because if I'd had like a bad day, say 4 years ago, I had a bad day, that would have affected my month. Whereas I have a bad day and I get up the next morning and carry on as if it's fine, because it just doesn't have that impact on me anymore. Yeah. So I think that's where I am now. And I think part of it is trying to kind of discover now where some of that came from. Now that I've kind of come far enough, I've done enough healing and work to think, right, now I can actually look and see where that came from. So that's kind of where I'm at, about to start that. So, and I think, I talk about, I finished therapy in January 2019 and that's amazing. Actually, I think therapy is great, and I think everyone should do it if you can, because I think it's awesome. But I think, so actually there's nothing wrong with that at all. So I'm always kind of cautious because I don't want to celebrate finishing that, because I don't think it's like you complete it and then you carry on, because it's not really the nature of it. So my plan actually is to go back to therapy at some point soon, because I think that it's great to unpack that and just like make sure that I'm still, that any trauma from that hasn't left a mark that I've ignored, or that, is a problem. And I don't think it is, but a lot of time has passed and lots of things have happened, and it's good it's good for everyone to keep up on their mental health, especially if they've got a history with it. Yeah. And if therapy is something that's accessible to you, then it's a great thing to do, actually, regardless of where you're at. I'd say that's
very wise counsel. Very wise counsel. It's interesting you mentioned about, there are scars. You've been healed, but there are scars. And I'm reminded of that, that sort of episode where Jesus is raised from the dead, and Thomas is like, unless I put my finger in his side, I'm not going to believe, kind of a thing. And I'm a lot like Thomas. Do you know what I mean? Anyway, and Jesus is like, he was healed. He was in a resurrected body, but he still had scars from the crucifixion. You could still touch the holes. You could still touch the scars on his hand. And I think scars is an interesting phrase, isn't it? We can experience the healing of God.
Yeah.
But quite often there are scars left, and we have to understand that. And I think it's great that you do, and that you're pressing into that with God and going, okay, God, what are these marks? What are these scars that I need to be aware of and being with? And it sounds like, Esther, one of the things that you talked a lot about was discovering your identity, who God made you to be. And we talk about this a lot in the church, to sort of find out your identity, who you are in God. But what are some of the key, if I can use a Christian word, revelations? What are some of the key things that you've discovered about your identity that just really make your heart sing?
I think, great question. I love it. Funnily enough, so I'm the student worker now at Frontline, and last night our student hub was about identity, and one of our students led a session on who we are, and it was awesome. So this is great. Got to try and remember it all now. I think that one of the things that I love is that I'm a daughter. And I think that's interesting because I have fantastic parents who have been very present. So it's not like I feel like I have a gap to fill in that sense. But the word daughter has always affected me because I've never, ever doubted that my parents are fully there for me and for me in every sense of the word. So I think it carries a lot of weight for me that God's like, well, you're my daughter as well. And actually that God loves me as a father more than my earthly dad does. And so I think, and I know like a lot of people feel very differently about that whole concept of parenthood with God and fathership. But I think that like that always had a really big impact on me because there's something so like intimate about that word and like precious that like fathers just like cradle their daughters. Like that's how I imagine it, with like wings, like in the Bible it's like wings of an eagle and being under shade and that sort of stuff. And I think that that's always had a bit of an impact on me. And I think the concept that God like just knows us so well. It's not that we're just like all this big group and he's like, yeah, those are my people. But he's like, each and every single one of you, I know you. I know the hairs on your head. I knitted you together in your mother's womb, made you as individuals so specifically and completely that he didn't make a mistake. And I would often think, I'm like, when I was ill, I was like, I'm broken or I'm a bit wonky. That was the thing I used to say when I was trying to make light of it. I was like, oh, I'm a bit wonky. And like, but I think actually God's like, well, no, because God doesn't make mistakes. And life happens and things are hard, but actually the things you go through are not the things that define you. Because God has said that you are chosen, that you are wonderfully and fearfully made, that you are completely enough, and that you are worth dying for. And if God says it, then it's true. And so actually it doesn't matter what doctors, family, friends say about you. They could be nice things, they could be great things. But actually what God says about you is true. And that's that you're chosen and complete and enough. And that thing of having a spirit of power and love and of a sound mind. And that just because I was afraid for a very long time does not mean that I have a spirit of fear. Because that's not how God created me. He has said that I have a spirit of power and of love and of a sound mind. So therefore I do, because that's what God said over me, not anyone else.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. I mean, that's such a brilliant story. And I again, thank you for sharing. And I've loved hearing every minute of it. And as we're sort of coming to the end here, Esther, one of the things I would love for you to do, you've touched on it a couple of times. I would love for you just to touch on the stigma of antidepressants, because I've seen this in the church a little bit. I don't think, I different people have different stories about it, and I just think it's probably worth just putting a finger on that a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So I started taking them when I was 18. It was a really weird experience because I basically went to the doctor and I was like, look, I'm still struggling. I've been coming for years. I got lots of informational leaflets about how to sleep better, which was just never helpful. But literally I turned 18 and they were like, here you go, and handed it over. I think it's probably just easier to prescribe antidepressants to legal adults. And I remember taking it home and telling my mum about it. And my mum and dad were really cautious. They were a bit like, oh, I don't know if this is a good idea. I think I was at a point where I was like, well, nothing else is working right now, so I'm just going to try it. And I think my parents now would say that it was the right thing to do, because at least my experience of it was that it gave me enough clarity of mind to be able to understand what I was thinking. And I think that my head before was so heavy and clouded that I would never have been able to start working through what I needed to work through to start to get better. And I wouldn't have been able to hear things properly or remember. I couldn't retain any information. And once I started taking those, I remember things much more clearly from that point. I think that, so I'm also super asthmatic, like my lungs are terrible. And I take an inhaler every single day, and I have done for most of my life since I was about 2 years old. And no one has any issue with that, because my lungs have an issue. So I take a medication and it helps me breathe. My mind had an issue, so I took a medication and it helped me breathe. And for me, I see that the same. And I know that it makes people nervous because it affects your mind. But God gave us resources and knowledge, and I don't think they're right for everybody, and that is kind of, sometimes doctors will be like, let's wait, let's try something else, and it's not always let's just run to that and just take that and nothing else. I think it's a two-pronged approach. You have to take those and do the therapy and talking and the work and the prayer and all of that. So it's not a one fits all solution. But I think that as the church, if we are okay with other medications, it needs to be the same for mental health, because people get too afraid to speak up about their mental health in church. And we need to be better at that, because people are suffering when they don't need to be. And, God says in the Bible that we are to weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. And so we have to do that. And the way that we do that is by speaking openly about things and having those conversations, even when they're hard. I think that it's fine. I think that if you're taking them properly and safely under doctor's advice and all that sort of stuff, then it's fine and it's helpful and it's needed when it's needed.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, my experience with antidepressants, not that I've personally taken them, so I'm not speaking from a personal experience here, but having, counselled a fair few folks over the years, it tends to be, like you say, when you use antidepressants in conjunction with other things. Yeah. So the clarity that brings your thinking, to use that clarity to, as the Bible say, to renew your mind, to start to build the healthy thought patterns around identity, to get involved in community, to get out of a position of loneliness, to get involved in church, and do those things that you've talked about that have obviously so helped you, I think is wonderful. So Esther, you are an absolute legend. You've come through this quite horrific illness, and like we said at the start, you've been married a month,
Yeah.
a whole month, you know, and a whole month, and well done. As you sit here in your early mid-20s, somewhere around there, what's your thinking, hopes, plans for the future?
Don't know. It's a short answer. So I'm currently doing the student work at Frontline and absolutely loving it. I'm not a person that has always kind of known what I wanted to do or anything like that. I think that I'm just really excited to see what God's going to use me for. Because I just think that He has amazing and exciting plans for everybody, and obviously they all look different, but there's definitely a certain amount of nervousness in not knowing what comes next. And I think, there's probably a lot of people that feel like that, especially coming around exam season for, teenagers and things. But I think that there's also a certain amount of excitement that you can have in not really knowing what you want to do, because it's like it's completely wide open for God to do whatever He wants. So for right now, sticking where we are until God tells us to go do something else. But yeah, just excited. And I think I feel very much at the start still, at the beginning of getting to know God more. I know there's so much that I don't know. And I think I'm really excited to just learn more of God and more about myself as well. And just of like what He's got in store. Yeah.
So one of the things which is lovely, and I'm sitting here listening to you talk, and I'm in my internal dialogue this is lovely, because what you have just shared is, I don't know what my future holds, but I know it's going to be good, and I'm excited about it. If I rewound the tape, not that this is recorded on tape, but do you know what I mean? If I rewound the tape, I'm old school, to the start of the conversation where you talked about how in your teenage years, and I wrote the phrase down, you didn't see your future. And that was a really, and what's lovely is now you see a future. You don't know what's in it. You don't know what it's going to be, but you know it's safe, and you're excited about it. And I think that is lovely. I can't think of another word to describe it. I just think it's wonderful, sat here listening to you talk, that actually you have hope and you have future, and that's amazing. It goes without saying, of course, if you are listening to this and you are struggling with mental health and you want to reach out to somebody, church is a great place to get involved. If you're not already in church, you can reach out to us at Crowd Church if we can help you. Just head over to the website www.crowd.church. We would love to hear from you. You can WhatsApp us, you can contact us via the website. But, do get stuck into community. Church community is wonderful. And like I said, we would love to hear from you if we can help. But Esther, it has been an absolute privilege to talk to you. Thank you so much for being here and just being so totally vulnerable and honest, but also, inspiring and encouraging and just lovely and wonderful. Thank you from me to you. God bless you.
Thanks for having me.
It's been great. It's been wonderful. So a big shout out to Esther for being here. If you would like to hear more Crowd stories, you can check out other recordings on our website. I keep saying it, crowd.church. You can head over to, well, actually, Esther, you may not realize this, but we have, I've recorded an interview with Anna Kettle, who's also been on Crowd, who was also a student worker.
Yes.
And it's not that everybody I know was a student worker at Frontline. I just want to clarify that right here at the start. It just is a coincidence that both you and Anna were, mentioned a little bit about being a student worker. But yeah, you can check out more Crowd stories on our website. Make sure you like and subscribe to the podcast and also to the live stream every Sunday, 6 p.m. It'd be great to meet you, great to connect with you if we haven't already done so. So from myself, from Esther, thank you so much for being with us, and bye for now. So there you have it. What A fantastic story. My very huge thanks to Esther for joining me today. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcast from, because we have some great stories about faith and courage from everyday people lined up, and I don't want you to miss any of them. No, I don't. So make sure you subscribe, and also while you're there, why not subscribe to the Crowd Church live stream as well? Come and say hi in the comments. Join us every Sunday, 6 p.m. here in the UK. That's 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And if you'd like help figuring out what that means for you and your country, go to our website, www.crowd.church. There's a little link and it will tell you the time for you. And just in case no one's told you yet today, you, my friend, are awesome. Utterly, utterly awesome. Yes, you are. It's just the way that God's made you, and it's a burden we just have to bear. Yes, it is. And that's okay. We're okay with that. Now, What's the Story is a podcast which has been produced by Crowd Church. You can find our entire archive of episodes on your favorite podcast app. The team that makes this show possible is Sadaf Bainon, George McQuaig, Estella Robin, and Tim Johnson. Our theme song is written by Josh Edmondson. And if you would like to read the transcript from today's show, or even view the show notes, find the links and all that sort of stuff, just head over to crowd.church, our website, where you can also sign up for our newsletter.